Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming to the Wilson Center. My name is Duncan Wood. I'm director of the Mexico Institute. We are delighted to have you here with us today for the presentation of a very, very important poll that is carried out every 2 years in Mexico on Mexican attitudes towards the world. It is a poll that is carried out by CIDE and the Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económica. We're delighted to have with us David Crow, who is one of my former colleagues. I was at the ETAM in Mexico City, but David has been at CIDE for a few years. And the two universities sometimes are seen as rivals, but actually I think they very much do. They cooperate with each other, and we have very good relations. This survey that David is going to present today is a gold mine of data that is fascinating. Throughout the years, I would say that this has been one of the most influential opinion polls that's carried out in Mexico, and particularly for those of us in the international affairs community, obviously. It's significant for a number of reasons. Over the years, it has shown how Mexican attitudes have become more globalized in some areas. It's shown how Mexican attitudes have reacted to different presidents in the United States. I think has been one of the most fascinating things, and very much reflecting global tendencies on that. I think we've seen how the opinions of the general public versus the elites in Mexico are often at quite opposite ends of the spectrum. And it's very fascinating for me in particular to have seen over the years how the elite opinion has actually changed as well. In some cases it's become more globalized, in some, at certain times it has become less so, it's become more national. I think this is one of the most fascinating things about this poll as we see it progress over time. For those of us who are focused on the bilateral relationship, I think that the data that comes out of this poll every 2 years on Mexican attitudes towards the United States is particularly important. And without stealing any of David's thunder, there's a question that comes up every 2 years, which asks, would Mexicans, would they be in favor of more or less total integration with the United States, forming one country with the United States, if it meant that their standard of living would improve significantly? And it's a fascinating question because the answers, well, this year, 30% of people say they're very much in favor of that. 30% say they're somewhat in favor of that. So 60% of Mexicans would actually be in favor of integration with the United States if we interpret it in that way. And then we see other questions that we can put alongside that. One of my favorite questions has always been the question on allowing foreigners to enter into investment in the oil sector. And Mexicans are very much opposed to that, but they would be more in favor of sort of total integration with the United States for their country. So you're more likely to sell your country than your oil, which I always think is a fascinating contrast to have there. But without going into any further detail on this, I'm going to turn the floor over to David. We're delighted to have him with us. I mean, David is assistant professor at the CIDE, and he's the director of the Mexico, the Americas, and the World Project. He's also a researcher for the Human Rights Perceptions Polls Project, and has served as associate director of the University of California Riverside Survey Research Center. He's a very well-known academic in Mexico. We're delighted to have you here with us, David. Please go ahead.
Duncan, thank you so much for that incredibly generous introduction. I think some of it's true. And thank you, all of you, for coming here and seeing the talk today. Can you hear me? Okay? Okay, good. I'm wondering if we might circulate a sign-up sheet. We'd be very interested in getting a register of people who are here. And so if you could just write down your name, email, and could you pass that around, please?
Yeah, sure.
Institutional affiliation.
Thank you.
Good. As Duncan mentioned, I'm in the CIDE's Center for Economic and Research and Teaching, the International Studies Division. And sort of the hallmark of our division is this poll, Mexico, the Americas, and the World. And my goal today is to let you know about the survey, that it exists, give you a brief overview, and also sort of hit some of the key findings from it, give a sort of taste, a smattering of the results. Duncan has characterized it, I hope accurately, as a gold mine. Let me extend the analogy further. It's a gold mine, but we need private investors to help extract the riches from it. So one of my chief goals today would be to let you know about not only the survey, but the database, the data and the questionnaires and the technical documentation are all available freely online. We really want scholars to use this data. We've been pretty good about reaching an audience of Mexican policymakers, but not very good at connecting with our academic peers here and elsewhere abroad. So part of the reason for this trip is to rectify that. Good. This year is next year I should say, will be the 10th year, the 6th time that we've carried out the survey. So we've done it biannually since 2004. Data and reports are free. I may mention this several times during the talk today. If there's one thing I want you to do, it's to take out your pens and take down this URL. That's where you can find all the databases and all the reports and all the technical documentation in the questionnaires. Now, it's an interesting survey in a number of ways. The first is that it's a really large scale, 2,400 respondents survey of the Mexican mass public, right? But we've also got a survey of leaders, elites, policy and business elites, distributed in 5 sectors: business, elected officials, appointed officials, so bureaucrats that staff the key government portfolios in the executive branch, civil society, which is a kind of heterogeneous category that includes unions and NGOs, and finally opinion leaders, which are journalists, and we're probably flattering ourselves to think that academics are opinion leaders, but they're in there too, right? And it's regionally representative. So we've got a really huge sample size, but we oversample from the north, the border states, and the south. So we have enough respondents in each of those 3 regions, north, center, and south, so you can do actually sort of subgroup comparisons that are statistically valid. So what this setup does is it allows you to do a number of things. First of all, the sample size for public is so large that you can do meaningful subgroup analyses. Men, women, we have questions on ethnicity, we have education, a lot of those sort of socio-demographic items that enable you to carry out statistically significant subgroup analyses. Then you can carry out analyses that contrast the public with leaders. Sometimes those opinions track each other, sometimes they're different. We'll see a little bit of that today. The fact that it's been going on since 2004 means that we have some pretty good time series. You can follow the evolution. Yeah, we can follow the evolution of the survey over time. I've mentioned the regional representativeness. There's another thing that I didn't put on this slide that bears mentioning, and that's that we've carried out the survey in a number of countries. It's Mexico, the Americas, and the world. Mexico's been in there every time since 2004. But in the first edition, 2004, we actually had the United States, China was in there. In other subsequent editions, among the countries that have joined the survey are Chile, Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia. The biggest time we had, the most countries we had was in 2010, where we had Brazil, Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico. So you're also able to do some cross-national comparisons in some pretty interesting countries. It really is a gold mine. Let's get the mining companies on this. Here's a brief overview of sort of the main thematic groups that we ask about. The first is interest in international affairs. How avid you follow them, how interested you are them. Then we have a series of questions on contact and migration. So this is if you've traveled abroad, if you've lived abroad, if you know someone that lives abroad, if you get remittances, that sort of thing. The classic topic in international relations, international security. So what threats do Mexicans see out there, and how do they wish to address them? A really fascinating battery of questions is on identity. How do Mexicans see themselves in relation to the world? And how do Mexicans see themselves in relation to their country? Are they more localist, more nationalist? In short, a series of questions about identity. We have the classic political knowledge battery, so a series of items that lets us gauge how much people know about politics. This is especially important, given the U.S. tradition of survey research, and one of the variables that you always want to ask about is, how much are these opinions based on knowledge, right? Mexico's foreign policy and role in the world. We have another one on international system, the rules of the game. And this last battery covers regional integration questions, and we have some interesting findings there that I'll present a little later on. Then we have a series of questions on relations with different regions of the world. Others is other countries in Latin America, specifically Mexico's neighbors to the south in Guatemala and Central America. Then relations with the U.S., the perennially important topic, and then other regions in the world. And finally, we have a battery of questions about political culture, attitudes towards Mexican democracy, and socio-demographic questions. Now, I guess our closest, we wouldn't say competitors quite, but surveys that do also cover Latin America would be the Latin American Public Opinion Project and Latino Barometer. What the value we think that we're adding here is that we are asking specifically about foreign policy. And traditionally in international relations, the sort of peripheral nations have been discarded. Foreign policy is really all about security stuff in the sort of North Atlantic region, right? So what we're saying is it's really important to study this in the context of places outside of North America and Europe. And Mexico and Latin America are some of those places. Again, here's the URL, if you're interested in taking a look at the data, and we urge you to do this. One of my colleagues says, don't take my word for it, go to the data, right? For survey researchers out there, I don't know if there's anyone with a background in survey research. This is another feature of the survey that's really interesting. We've done a number of survey experiments, over 100, and they consist in split samples. So some of them we alter the question stem, so the wording of the question, and we see if that alters people's attitudes, right? And I'm doing, for example, a piece of research on Mexican attitudes towards economic liberalization, free trade, that kind of thing. And it turns out that if you introduce sort of thought or stimulate reflection on the advantages and disadvantages of free trade, policy preferences are altered. I guess it's not a new insight that the way you phrase a question sort of conditions the answers, but we've got a number of experiments that allow you to explore exactly that. Then we have a number of scale experiments, so asking things about a 4-point scale as opposed to a 7-point scale. Some of the topics we've done experiments about include identity, regional integration preferences, attitudes towards immigration and out-migration, foreign policy preferences, etc. So for the survey researchers out there, we've got a wealth of survey experiments that will allow us to elucidate not only substantive topics, but topics in survey methodology. Good, let's get to the findings. General attitudes on interest, contact, and foreign policy priorities. Then there we have our 3 regions, the north, the center, and the south. First of all, international contact and trips abroad. So how many times have you traveled outside Mexico? The green line is the public. The blue line is the leaders. So we can see, it's not surprising that, that the leaders have traveled more than the public. What is perhaps surprising is that in this last panel here, more than 10 trips abroad, we see that it goes down, the number of leaders who have taken more than 10 trips abroad declines dramatically. And that's, we think, an effect of the recession, right? Most Mexicans have not traveled abroad. If we break this down a little bit, of the 76% who have not traveled abroad, these are reversed. This should be south, center, north. So Yeah, sorry, my mistake. But from the south, which should be that top bar, 85% has never traveled abroad. The center is 76%, and the north is 67%. So we see dramatic variations across the three regions of Mexico. And this is a good illustration of the types of things you can also do with the survey. You can have these regional breakdowns. International contact via migration. In 2010, we dramatically expanded the questions that we have on migration. And we can see that this top line is number of people with relatives living outside Mexico. It's declined from 61% in 2004 to 49% in 2012. This follows what we know about Mexican migration from official government numbers, both the census and the INEGI down in Mexico, and that we're essentially at zero net migration right now, right? But there remains a large stock of Mexican migrants here. The yellow line is relatives that used to live in this household and now live outside Mexico. It dipped in 2010, went down from 29% to 23%, but then went back to 34%. Those two facts combined tell us you have less people coming, and those fewer people are concentrated in a greater number of households. So that perhaps talks about family migration networks. The blue line is the percentage of Mexicans who have contact with foreigners living in Mexico. So about a fifth, 1 in every 5 Mexicans knows a foreigner, has some contact, regular contact with someone from a foreign country living in Mexico. And we see that this orange line is remittances. And it goes from, we see that it also tracks what we know about remittances from the Bank of Mexico numbers, right, Banxico. Goes up into, crests sort of in 2006, 2007, declines dramatically with the recession, but it's gone back up in 2012, up to 20%. So again, this sort of provides a validation of what the official numbers tell us, which is that remittances are going up slightly. Maybe out-migration from Mexico to the United States has increased. We don't know yet. We just don't have the numbers to be able to assess that yet. But I'm sure the demographers will make their projections and tell us soon. Intent to immigrate. If you could, would you live abroad? And the number of people who say yes is about 42%. As shown by the red line, but the yellow line is would you do so if you didn't have documents? That declines dramatically, reflecting, we think, the sort of hardness or the hardening, I guess we could say, of U.S. migration policy. The wall isn't particularly inviting. But also, from what we know, the cost of crossing without documents has also gone up. From around $2,000, $2,500, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. It's probably around $3,000 now. Where would you go? 60% to the United States. This is down from previous years, where U.S. was probably around 70%. So the U.S. still remains the most important or most attractive potential destination, but we see that that the number of countries to which Mexicans would consider going is diversifying. Okay. International threats. What do Mexicans think threatens them, their country? This is the number of people who say that it's a very serious threat. I think the answer options were, is this a threat? Is this a very serious threat, a somewhat serious threat, a slightly serious threat, or not at all serious threat? What we found, we're considering changing this question. What we found is that once you identify something as a threat, well, people think, oh, it must be a threat, right? So the value this has, though, is perhaps not in the absolute number, but in the ranking, sort of the ordering of the threats. And it's good for cross-national numbers, which I don't present here. But the rank order of the threats has been relatively stable over the years. Drug trafficking and organized crime, not particularly surprising. Global warming, though, and scarcity and the high cost of food. So food security and the greenhouse effect are particularly worrisome to Mexicans. This is interesting, I think, because the Calderon administration had put global warming as sort of one of its big policy initiatives. And I think it's an area in which Mexico could show leadership. The Peña Nieto administration, unfortunately from my point of view, seems to have dropped this, but it's a country in which Mexico does have a really high capacity, a lot of really well-educated climatologists and state capacity to measure and enact policy, implement policy measures that are designed to reduce global warming. At the bottom, interestingly enough, is that rich countries implement stricter migration controls. Undocumented migration into Mexico is not seen as a threat, and the development of China as a world power is not seen as particularly threatening by the public. It is somewhat by leaders, as I'll show later. In the middle, we have the global economic crisis, epidemics, human rights violations. Now, this is a question about the role Mexico should play in the region, in the world. So which of the following statements is closest to what you think about Mexico's role in Latin America should be? Mexico should seek to be a leader. That's the orange line. It's a middle ground. Notice, though, that in the right panel for leaders, it's gone sharply up. The Mexican elites do want Mexico to recover the leadership role that it had, say in the 60s, 70s, maybe 80s, right? The plurality of the public seems to be that Mexico should participate along with other countries without trying to be a leader. There seems to be this kind of innate Mexican aversion to interventionism and sort of a vindication of self-determination as the cornerstone or the keystone of Mexican foreign policy. Mexicans should stay out of most efforts of Latin American countries rejected by leaders and public alike. So the plurality position among the mass public seems to be cooperation. Mexico should be not even primus inter pares, but just pares, right? One of many nations. Cooperation with Central America, taking into account the economic situation of our country. So this is the crisis in Mexico. How much do you think Mexico should support with financial resources the development of economies of Central American countries? So this is foreign aid to Central America. And we see that a plurality favors it, right? But it's actually sort of evenly divided. So very much and somewhat, that's, what would that be? 49%, right? And 48% for not and a little. So it's almost evenly split. Leaders, we can see on the right, do favor greater foreign assistance. So sort of, I guess, willing to put their money where their mouth is more than the public. We find this as a sort of a consistent thing in the surveys, that Mexicans do favor a more active role for their country, but don't seem really willing to devote the resources to doing this. Now, we move to the second block of slides, which is sort of economic liberalization in Mexico, which I think might be interesting to some people here. Mexicans do have a predominantly liberal orientation towards sort of an international economic agenda, but as we shall see, this orientation, this liberal orientation, has its limits. And Duncan pointed out those limits can be summed up in one word: oil, right? Approval of foreign direct investment and free trade. So to what extent do you think foreign investment benefits Mexico? We see the public on the top, and we have 77% say that it benefits somewhat or a lot. Leaders are even more overwhelmingly in favor. 90% say that foreign direct investment benefits Mexico somewhat or a lot. So we find broad public support in general for foreign direct investment. The other sets of countries are a series of aspects, economic aspects, that Mexicans were asked to evaluate the free trade, the effects of free trade on. The economy of developed countries, so Mexicans think that free trade benefits the US and other developed countries. And they think that it benefits the national economy, but by a lesser degree. We can see the blue is the leaders, and the green bar is the public. So the leaders are a little more bully on economic sort of international liberalization than the public is, but the public seems to support it too. Living standards of people like you, again, 60% of the public, 77% of the, it's one of the bigger breaches, right? This public and the leaders seem to be divided on whether free trade benefits me personally, right? Mexican farming, so this is the countryside. The leaders actually think that it benefits free trade, it benefits Mexican rural development less than the public does. But both are clearly, this is clearly one of the weak spots of free trade, and the environment. So the countryside and the environment sort of remain areas in which Mexicans are wary or skeptical of the benefits of free trade. Evaluation of free trade agreements. NAFTA, the free trade agreement with the European Union, and finally the free trade agreement with Japan. This is a question that was asked of leaders, right? So again, the majority position seems to be support for these free trade agreements, but it goes down for the European Union and Japan. One thing that we find is that that the more you know about something, the more you kind of approve of it, right? So we're unsure to what extent this finding reflects a real evaluation that the European Union and Japan and free trade agreements with Japan are really worse than NAFTA, or just that people don't know about them as much. We're trying to still figure out a way to separate that. Like, what are the effects of just knowing about something and being able to offer an opinion from a true evaluation? This is one of the challenges that we have. Now, there seems to be what we might call a North American model of integration, or maybe a more accurate way of putting this would be a Latin American model of integration. We can think about European integration, right? The investment goes where it's best deployed. The goods go where people want to buy them, but the people can also move amongst the countries. The North American model we should see is a little bit different. So this is the percent of people who either strongly or somewhat agree with the following propositions, right? That would favor Latin American integration. Building roads and bridges, overwhelming support. Free circulation of investment, also really overwhelming support. Free flow of goods and services. So far, so good, right? Overwhelming majorities of the public, and especially the leaders, support all these things. But when we get to things like political integration, right? Creating a Latin American parliament, still majority support, but the majorities are thinner, right? Having a common foreign policy, same deal, right? And we don't need, there's less than majority support. The majority position actually supports not having a common currency in Latin America. Forming a Latin American army is rejected really overwhelmingly by leaders, just 20%. And the free movement of people, rejected by the public, 45%, only 45% is in favor of it, and favored but just barely by the leaders. So the upshot of this is in contrast to this European model of integration where everything and everybody gets to go everywhere. Here we have the money and the things get to go where they want, but the people have to stay put, right? Now, this is the limits of this sort of economic liberalization. Mexican government prevent foreigners to invest in electricity. The green line is the public. It's gone up from 27 to 48% among the public. Again, that's the green line, but still less than 50%. The blue line is the leaders, and that's gone down from 77 to 67%. The leaders' support for investment in the oil sector has declined dramatically from 76 to 59% from 2004 to 2012. And despite all the publicity campaigns that we're getting now, this is the topic right now in Mexico, right? Is should we open up Pemex, Petróleos Mexicanos, to private investment, right? But it's not a new debate. This is Calderón tried to do it, I think, in 2009, and just ran up to a wall of opposition in Congress, but also protests in the streets. And so despite really 5 years of really intense publicity campaigns saying we need investment, we need private investment to do exploration and things like this. The government really seems, two governments now, Calderón and Peña Nieto, seem to have really been unable to open up, sort of convince public opinion. Right? It's a really intense media campaign. And I'll say right now that it's really debate over how to frame the issue. The word privatization really seems to raise a lot of hackles in public opinion, right? And so the government's insisting it's not a privatization, it's a modernization, right? It's a reform, right? But they explicitly reject the word privatization. So it's a battle over framing, how we frame the issue. and the public seems to really believe the privatization frame. Good. Mexican nationalism and identity, but tinged by pragmatism. This was something that Duncan talked about in his introduction, is that a strong sort of Mexican nationalism and pride in being Mexico coexists with this pragmatism where you're willing to merge with another country if it improves your standard of living, right? I don't think we addressed that particular question in this slide. Had I known, we could have brought it. But okay, this is adherence to a national identity, right? So this is the big thing in Mexican history since independence has been the construction of this sort of liberal modern identity, national identity, that would supersede sort of local ethnic, and local regional identities, right? And the project has been successful most places. In the general public, 64. The question is, do you feel more Mexican or more Yucatecan, or more Mexican or more Sinaloan, right? So more Mexican or more from your state, right? The public, amongst the general public, so all of Mexico, 64% identifies with the Mexican identity, and 34% with their local identities. In the north, it goes up. They're 70% versus 29%. The center, it's about the same. In the south, however, it's reversed. So people from the southern states, the Yucatan Peninsula, Chiapas, Oaxaca, Guerrero, definitely feel that they're more from those states than that they belong to this sort of national identity. This has been constant throughout the survey from 2004. The South is always the more localist, with the exception in 2010, where a majority of Southern Mexicans felt more national than local. And we attribute that to a sort of bicentennial effect, right? You can't be more Chiapanecan than Mexican when it's the 200th anniversary of your independence from Spain. And the leaders are very strongly nationalist, right? Or at least they say they are. I don't know what those circles are behind this slide. I think it just kind of got mixed up. So pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. This is really interesting. The question is, do you think it's good or bad to disseminate the ideas of other and customs of other countries in Mexico? So how open are you to foreign influences? And in both among leaders and public, this is one case where sort of opinion tracks each other. Leaders, 92%, and it's gone up since 2006. But amongst the general public, it's nearly doubled since 2004. So we see a sort of greater cosmopolitanism or greater receptiveness to foreign ideas, for which I personally am grateful. So again, I think this is this idea that openness or receptiveness to foreign ideas can coexist with my being Mexican. I can enjoy ideas, things, values, customs from other countries and be really Mexican at the same time. Foreign policy, and this is sort of a hot topic, is we've got this great army in Mexico that basically exists to go around and help out in natural disasters and every once in a while repress dissent, right? But what else could we do with it? It's great. It's a really well-equipped, well-trained army and a tradition of civilian leadership that's the envy of other Latin American countries. So the idea is if the UN asks Mexico to participate in the military or peacekeeping force, the blue helmets, right, being sent to somewhere in the world, what should Mexico do? Should it participate or not participate? So not participate is the red line on the left panel. And we can see that support for participation in the blue helmet, the peacekeeping operations, has increased by 10 percentage points. It's fluctuated among the public, or I'm sorry, among the leaders in the right panel, but you have a majority of leaders, a bare majority that does favor participation. So the elites are sort of a little more wary of Mexican Army's participation in these peacekeeping operations. this was one of the survey experiments we did. What about if it's in conflict zones? This wording of the questions that emphasizes the conflict, right? And we can see that should not participate becomes a majoritarian position. So again, it's a frame effect. It depends on how you frame it. There is support for peacekeeping, but it may not be all that deep, once it comes to getting the boots on the ground, as we like to say here. I'm going to skip that and we'll go. Okay, supranational identities. So we saw, are you Mexican or are you Oaxacan, right? This is, are you Mexican or supranational identities, not Mexican. It's which region do you identify with? Latin American, Mexicans still feel that they're Latin Americans, but it's declined from 62% to 50% among the public. It's held steady at more or less 50, 52% among leaders, right? They feel that they're Latin American. Now, citizen of the world has gone up slightly among the public from 22 to 27%, and it's fluctuated among leaders. Again, we have this gap in 2010, the bicentennial effect, right? More Latin Americans than citizens of the world. But in general, the cosmopolitan identity for leaders is held steady at around 38%, right? At the bottom, though, are North American and Central American. So the geographical regions to which Mexico is closest, North America and Central America, are the ones with which they least identify. So these supranational identities aren't really rooted in geography. The main motivation behind asking this question was, well, after 20 years of NAFTA, has this zone of trade and commercial influence translated over into a common identity? And the answer is clearly no, it hasn't. Alignments, sympathies, and antipathies. This is a thermometer scale from 0 to 100. How am I doing on time?
5 more minutes.
5 more minutes? Okay. This is evaluations of countries. The countries that are well evaluated are typically sort of the well-off countries. The United States is top among public at 71. Again, it's not a percentage. It's a scale of 0 to 100. This is the average evaluation. Same value for leaders, but 5th in rank. But the same group of countries is there. The main thing here is that in the middle group of countries, we have sort of the better off Latin American countries, right? The Argentinas, the Chiles, the Costa Ricas. Cuba gets a sort of, I think that probably has to do with the historical comity between Cuba and Mexico. And then in the last group of countries, we have sort of the international bad boys, right? Russia, Venezuela, Iran, Israel, and some of the Latin American countries like Peru and Ecuador, right? Broad agreement between leaders and the public, right? So if we go by regions, North America, Europe, developed countries are the highest, Asia and the BRICS, Latin America and Central America at the bottom. And that's true for leaders as well as for the public. So we've got this contradiction, right, in which Mexicans feel Latin American, but they don't actually seem to like Latin Americans as much as they like other nationalities. It's like, oh, he's my friend, but so you'll recommend him for the job? No. Right? It's an analogy that one of my colleagues uses. This is what I was talking about, the relationship between evaluation of knowledge and the ratings of the country. On the x-axis, we have the percentage of people that offered an opinion about a country, right? On the vertical y-axis, we have the evaluation of the country. So a lot of people know about offer an opinion about the United States, and it's well evaluated, right? Not that many people know about Iran, and it's not that well evaluated. So again, this is a sort of an interesting survey research question. Is how do we tease out the part of that that's the real evaluation? Because it's conceivable that people do like the United States, and conceivable that people don't really like Iran, independently of how much they know about them, right? Influence of China and Mexico is viewed as positive by the public. It's the plurality position. But leaders are more wary. Neither positive or negative is the plurality, and positive gets a 35%. So the public doesn't really seem to be scared of China. Recall that it was evaluated at the absolute bottom of the most serious threats, right? But the leaders are a little more wary, perhaps because of the sort of labor market competition that China is giving Mexico. Regional preferences, what region of Mexico should pay more attention to? Public feels that it's North America followed by Latin America. This order of preferences is reversed for the leaders. The leaders want to start paying more attention to Latin America. Last couple of slides, U.S. image. So which of the top two panels, or which of the following best describes your feeling about the United States? Trust, distrust. Trust is the green line for the public, and distrust the red line. We can see that those two things have now evened out. It's not 50-50, but it's 40-40, right? We're leaving out the people who say they don't know. For leaders, we see greater fluctuation, right? But with trust going up. So more leaders trust than distrust the US, and the public's evenly divided. Admiration and disdain. And again, for the public, the green line is admiration, which clearly outpaces disdain by about 250%. Leaders have always admired the US more than they've disdained it. Disdain has gone up since 2008, but admiration has gone up since 2000. It's the top blue line. And disdain has gone down. It's by half. It's on a sort of continually downward trajectory. Why? Our feeling is that this is an Obama effect, right? So Obama's clearly bought the U.S. some goodwill in Mexico, despite the continued deportations, despite not being able to get the immigration agreement. But I think sort of Mexicans are giving him bonus points for the DREAM Act, which is something a lot of Mexicans know about and follow very closely. And they feel that, at least he's sort of trying on immigration. He hasn't been able to do anything, but it's not his fault, right? That's what we think is behind these numbers here. Let's see. Support for cooperation on U.S. with security issues. So are you for or against Mexico's receiving financial aid from the U.S. to fight drug trafficking and organized crime? 53% of the public is for it, right? And 70% of the leaders are for it. So we have pretty broad support among both leaders and public for continued receipt of financial assistance on the U.S. From the U.S. for this. Now, we asked, of the people who are in favor, we asked them sort of a follow-up question. What if the U.S. consisted on supervising the use of the resources? Broad support of the leaders and the public said they would still support it even under those circumstances, right? And if the U.S. asked to be able to send agents to operate inside Mexico, more of the public is for it than against it still. So this is really interesting. The leaders, on the other hand, again, it's this sort of nationalism, this nationalist rejection of this encroachment on Mexican sovereignty. What's behind this? Mexicans are desperate. The violence is it's been spiraling out of control. It doesn't show any signs of abating. It looks like we're in sort of a long haul for this sort of Colombian type 2 or 3 decade cycle before it abates. And I think people are just anything that can help out, even if it means accepting these encroachments on sovereignty. So it's part of this pattern where if we can get some benefit from it, we're willing to cede a little bit of sovereignty, right? So we're willing to have the U.S. merge with Mexico, and we're willing to allow U.S. to send in agents. Now, there might be also a little bit of realism. People know that this is already happening, right? So, good. Paradoxes and contradictions about migration. Here, opinion of foreigners varies by national origin. Mexicans are generally favorable. Around 67% have either a good or very good opinion of foreigners. Maybe it's a little lower. It's probably around 62%, if I recall correctly. But again, Americans, Chinese, Spanish are relatively well evaluated, but when we get down to Cubans, Argentinians, and especially Guatemalans, they're least well evaluated. So it's like he's my friend, but don't hire him for the job, right? Impression of Central American migrants in Mexico is we have 58% with somewhat or very favorable. So there seems to be some sort of public compassion for the plight of Central American trans migrants, right? Varies by issue. So we have a series of 5 things that we ask about with people who migrate to Mexico. And by the way, Mexico is now, it's starting to perceive itself as a receiving country, right? Not only south-south migration, but foreigners from sort of developed countries are seeking professional opportunities in Mexico. So we have 77% of the public, 74% feel that foreigners contribute to the economy. A large percentage feels that they bring innovative ideas. This is, what is that? 51% say that they weaken versus 46% say that they weaken ideas, Mexican values and traditions, right? So slight rejection, though 2010, I think it was 48-48. So it's edged up a little bit against, but against the foreign presence. People, though, about a similar percent say that they take away jobs from Mexicans. So Mexicans are, a majority of Mexicans supports these propositions that foreigners weaken national customs, take away jobs, but it's a very, very, very bare majority. And they frankly reject the proposition that foreigners generate insecurity. Here the idea is that we asked a series of mirror questions, right? Do you think that Mexicans abroad should have access to public education? Do you think that foreigners in Mexico should have access to public education, right? We asked this about 20 questions apart in the survey, so we tried to sort of fool survey takers into thinking that they weren't related, but what we really want to do is compare. Now we see that inevitably Mexicans support more rights for their co-nationals abroad than for foreigners living in Mexico. But there are some surprises or some patterns. Support for foreigners having access to public education is pretty high. And also for family reunification, the third thing. So, the difference between rights demanded and rights conceded is slightly greater for economic issues, getting a job, being able to compete in local labor markets under the same conditions as citizens. And the gap is really strong for being able to vote. Although the interesting thing there is 61% of Mexicans still say that foreigners should be able to vote in Mexico, even if they're not citizens. Still waiting on them to enact that one. Actions against undocumented immigration. We can see most people support a temporary, this is undocumented migrants in Mexico. By the way, I like the term irregular better. As someone pointed out to me the other day. Undocumented, it's kind of a harder status to resolve, right? You have to get them documents, but that takes time. And so irregulars, well, the solution is really easy. Regularize them, right? So in the migrants' rights community, the term of preference now seems to be irregular more than undocumented. But we said undocumented, people support the temporary workers programs. They also support border controls, though, right? Support for deportation is frankly disturbingly high. But then there's some support for allowing them to enter without obstacles. And finally, people want to build walls on the southern border. We have 12% of the leaders, but a worrisome figure for the public, which is 25%, right? No, 27%, 26%. Anyway, my colleagues were very alarmed that 26% of Mexicans wanted to construct borders on the Mexican law. As a survey researcher, I was a little more sanguine because I think you can get about 30 people to agree with any proposition, no matter how crazy or nutty it is. But my colleagues were really worried about that figure. Wrapping up, the main lessons. Mexicans are generally positive on liberalization, except for oil. Support also depends a little bit on the way you ask the question. When you stimulate reflection on advantages and disadvantages, support goes from very high to just high. Right? Mexicans have their heart in Latin America, but their heads in North America. Right? Mexicans are generally welcoming of foreigners, but Latin Americans are the worst evaluated. Finally, Mexicans demand more for their co-nationals abroad than they're willing to give immigrants in Mexico, which I think goes to prove that Mexicans are pretty much like everybody else, right? Good, that's all I got. We can open it up for questions, comments.
Thank you, David. Let's go straight in. We've got a very short time for questions, but there's an enormous amount of information here. I may see a hand back over there, please, Patrick.
Sure. Thanks, Duncan. Patrick Kilbride.
There's a microphone coming, Patrick. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Duncan and David. Great presentation. Really appreciate it. Patrick Kilbride with the U.S. Chamber. So a couple of related questions. First, you asked about how Mexicans felt about committing financial resources for Central America, but it'd be very interesting to see what they would say about policies towards integration that maybe don't impose direct fiscal costs, but that require some liberalization of some economic opening with Central America. In a related vein, be very interested how Mexicans would respond if you asked on the question about trade and movement of people and so forth, what they would say specifically about the Pacific Alliance, where Mexico is involved with Chile, Colombia, and Peru. So, are they distinguishing between their close neighbors in Central America and, maybe some of the more faster-growing economies of South America? And then finally, Twitter handle, if we want to tweet any of your stuff, what's your preference? Is there one?
Is there a hashtag or a...
There is. We have opened a Twitter account, but I don't have it on me right now.
We'll get it from David, and we'll make sure it's up on our site, okay? We'll also make sure that the link is up.
These are great. We're considering major revisions of the questionnaire in 2014, and we've gotten some wonderful suggestions. Certainly asking about trade with both of those groups would be helpful. CAFTA, for example, people's evaluation of CAFTA. We do have some questions on the survey that would sort of allow us to get at general attitudes towards South versus Central America. And I think the answer, some of that I presented today. And I think there's a more favorable disposition towards South Americans than towards Central Americans, which are kind of viewed as a problem to some extent in Mexico. But yeah, we've asked this in a very general way, and it's not specifically about trade. So we'll take that into account, Brian.
Any other questions here?
Yes.
I'm Jane Terry from the Organization of American States, so I was looking at this from a hemispheric foreign policy point of view.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'd be very interested in questions about international organizations in general, their evolution, sub-regional organizations, UNASUR, CELAC, relations with the European Union, and how they relate to global and regional trade rules, human rights conditions, kind of leading toward where these institutions could go that would best reflect both Mexican leadership and Mexican public opinion to be valuable for the future.
Right. We've got questions on some of the things you've mentioned. I didn't present them in the slides today, but we ask, for example, about evaluations of international organizations such as the United Nations. The OAS is in there as well. And these international organizations are evaluated very favorably. Mexicans clearly see themselves as part of this international framework that they want to work within. On the other hand, we ask about a series of priorities for Mexican foreign policy, one of which we put is, strengthening the OAS and strengthening the United Nations, and that's at the bottom of the list of foreign policy priorities. So, again, it seems to be a case of, well, this would be nice, but okay, kick down, no, don't want to do it, right? So, if you give me your card, I can, we can send you the list of questions that might be of interest to you. You can also consult the questionnaire online for free. It's there, but I'll be happy to point out some of the questions that might be useful to those kind of concerns. Yeah. Jesse.
Good morning, everybody. Just so this doesn't seem like a loaded question, I should probably identify myself as a former member of the Mexico, the Americas, and the World research team. Thanks for the presentation today, David. It's great to see development of the survey. I was wondering, with respect to the battery of questions on trust in institutions, community participation in government, whether there has been any bump that might be attributed to a pacto effect. And the perception of more efficient government under the Peña Nieto administration.
Right.
Or whether it's too early to tell.
Before I answer this, I should say that Jesse was at C-Day for, it was more than a year, right? It was 2 years.
2 years, yeah.
2 years you were down there, Jesse Fletcher. And worked directly with us, helping to produce some sort of research notes, and did a wonderful job. So it's great to see you here, man. The answer is no. The survey was taken in September of 2012, which was before Peña Nieto took office, before there was any talk of the pact. So, we haven't observed, as part of the political culture battery of questions, we asked about participation in political parties, in community organizations, this sort of thing. And the question is, well, has this gone up maybe as a result? There's the Pacto por México, the sort of agreement between all the parties. We're all going to get along now, and so maybe the idea was that this is strengthened political culture and encouraged participation in civil society. And the timing of the survey was such that it just doesn't permit us to evaluate that. But besides that, we haven't seen the participation numbers seem to stay about stable. So,
Okay.
so no bump and nothing attributable to the pact.
All right, great. Thank you.
Sure.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to have to call it to a bring it to a close there. But thank you very much, David, for your presentation here. Thank you very much for your presence, ladies and gentlemen. I've got a number of takeaways here. I think it's fascinating that Mexicans identify global warming as a major threat to security, but not natural disasters. And the two things are very closely linked in Mexico, obviously. And I think that maybe we'll see a change in that after this year's weather events. Mexicans are willing to be internationally active, but they don't want to devote resources to it. I think that's that is the pragmatism again. And again, Mexicans aren't that different from people around the world. But I think the thing that really stood out for me today was that little piece of data about the South, how it's overwhelmingly that only 35% of people in the South identify with being Mexican ahead of being from their region. And historically, that has been the case, of course, in parts of the South, that you've seen, for example, in Yucatan, more connection with the United States than with the center of the country historically. But I think it's fascinating. I'm trying to work out reasons for that apart from history. Is it the role of indigenous cultures down there? Is it the hangover of the '94 uprising in Chiapas? What are the other factors that there? Is it just that being sort of less part of the national project, I think, throughout history has left this legacy? But fascinating information. I myself am going to go down the gold mine and see what I can bring up.
Please do.
Thank you, David, very much for your presence here today. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.